Vicki, should we start by showing your clip?
Well, sure. And there's a young man named Wyatt in the back who, and can I just set this up? Or
Please
do you want to, would you like to introduce me?
Well, no. Okay.
I don't know. I just seem like
I am so honored to be Vicki's interlocutor for her wonderful, gorgeous-looking, and beautifully written and beautifully researched book, Wray and Robert Riskin, A Hollywood Memoir, by Victoria Riskin, who was their daughter. And I know her as Vicki, and Vicki has been many things: a film writer, a film producer, a psychotherapist, and now a kind of an amazing author of this amazing book. I would like to read you the AP sort of writer's dream review of her book, and this was the AP's review. If there was an Academy Award for movie books, Victoria Riskin would be making room beside the Oscar her father won for writing the romantic comedy classic It Happened One Night. Part biography, part Hollywood history, part love story, Riskin's memoir about her parents is captivating and poignant. And it is, and it's a beautiful book.
Thank you.
And it's fascinating, and there's lots about Hollywood in it that I didn't know, and if you read it, you will find it fascinating too, all the labor disputes, and then tons of more glamorous stuff as well. But I want Vicki to introduce the clip and talk first before I ask you some questions.
So the book is about my mother, Fay Wray, who was famous for being in King Kong, and my father, who was well known as a screenwriter, probably the top screenwriter in Hollywood in the 1930s, who penned It Happened One Night, Mr. Deeds Goes to Town, Lost Horizon, You Can't Take It With You, Lady for a Day, American Madness, Meet John Doe, and on, and help put Columbia Pictures on the map. My story is really twofold. It's one, and I think if any of you came to the panel, I explained that when I was a little girl, my father had a stroke and became incapacitated and died. So it's my journey back to find him as a person and reconstruct his life. And in the process, I wanted to reconstruct my mother's life too. I wanted to understand how a little girl from a mining town, small mining town in Utah, found her way at age 14 to Hollywood, and what that was like for her. And the challenges that she faced, which were considerable, and her, how she managed, her resilience. And I wanted to retrace the story of a young boy who grew up first generation, born in the Lower East Side of New York, of Jewish parents who had immigrated from Belarus, and come ultimately to Hollywood and became hugely successful, and their life and their times. But to sort of capture and to help paint a picture for you, I put together this little photographic clip that I'd like to play. And the theme of it is, I think you'll see, that despite all their success, which was considerable, they were missing something in their lives, and that was each other. And it took a while until they found one another. So maybe, Wyatt, you could play this clip.
So Vicki, before I ask you about these two very special parents you had, I wanted to talk to you as a writer of this lovely book. And I think everybody, at least I am, interested in how these fragile bubbles of a notion become a big, hefty, handsome, actual reality. So can you tell us a little bit about, you're not the only person I've met who has started writing a memoir because they joined a memoir writing group. This
Right.
seems to happen again and again, and very successfully. So can you tell us a little bit about how that started?
If anyone asks you to join a memoir writing group, you should say no, because your life is going to change and you have to be prepared for that. But I didn't know that at the time. I was living in Santa Barbara and sat next to this very lovely woman who I didn't know. We started chatting, and she said, I teach memoir writing. She's rather well known as a memoir writing person, mentor, teacher. And she said, maybe you'd like to come, just try it out, see if you like it. I had finished writing and producing in Hollywood. I'd moved full-time to Santa Barbara. And for whatever reason, I said, okay. And okay is like a big decision, actually, in your life. It's like if someone says, would you like to get married? And you say, okay. You go off on a very different track, right? So I brought in, each week the women would sit in a circle. It was women, which I approve of. And we would bring in maybe 3 or 5 pages of our writing. And I came in with my first little 3 or 4 pages of writing. And they leaned forward and they listened and they laughed and they cried. And I thought, this is going pretty well. And the woman said afterwards to me, who ran the group, that was fabulous. Now, she used fabulous a lot. I learned later. She loved to be very encouraging. But it was enough for me to keep on going. And so, Penny, I piled up these chapters of my recollections. Right. And sometimes they were stories about other people who I cared about and wanted to know more about. It was a bit hodgepodge, to be honest with you. It really was kind of nice but shapeless and without a driving narrative. And when I finished, I gave it to a couple of people, and they said, this is good. I like this. Somebody said they thought they could publish it. But
this is your memoir. No,
this is
this
is all mostly about me. And
right.
Truthfully, I didn't find myself that interesting. So someone said, I really would like to know more about your parents. And that was enough for me. I said, oh my God, that's the book. That's the book. So I start the book with my own recollections, a bit of me, but the story really is, who were these two people?
You
and
said,
sorry. Yeah.
Sorry, finish what you were saying. Sorry.
No, it's just a bit like when so many people at this festival are talking about going back and history. This was like going back and finding these two people. Yeah.
Right. You said when we were talking on the phone, or maybe it was yesterday, under the tent, you said, I felt after these two people said it, I really want to know more about your parents. You said, I felt so free after that.
Yeah.
What had you been liberated from?
Well, I've been liberated from my own confusion about whether I had a book to write or not.
Right.
I mean, once I knew I had a book to write, I did one chapter starts with it starts with my own early recollections, but then it's a chapter about my father, then my mother, my father, my mother, like a train, 2 trains moving until they finally come to the same station and they meet each other and fall in love. And oh my goodness, it was an amazing journey for me. It was diving into the deep end and swimming with them again, right. and seeing who they were in their life and times. Yeah.
Do you think that, had you fiddled with that idea before? Because it might seem almost, not obvious, but they were they're such appealing people, and they were certainly public people and very accomplished people, and pretty glamorous, that you came to this idea more organically than somebody who might say, gee, I had these 2 famous parents, why don't I write about them? That you had to feel your way toward that. It was very interesting to me.
Yeah, I had to feel my way towards that. And but once I knew, it moves chronologically back and forth between each of them, but once I knew where I was going, I felt secure, but it was daunting, because then I had to go find out not just about them,
right.
but the times that they lived in. Because we all we're living through an era right now, and it's very similar to what they lived through in the 30s, when it's the beginning of the anti-communist movement, or the communist movement and the anti-communist movement, those in America who believed Hitler was a great bulwark against Russia, and those who were trying to alarm the country to the dangers of Hitler. The beginning of the labor movement, the building of the labor, that was like, and the studio system,
Yes.
the complexity of the studio system, the depression, the fact that the studios were on the edge of going bankrupt, and the role that my mother and my father played in trying to help rescue the town and the country. They were big, important backdrop.
Yeah.
So I had to read about that and understand it, but not overload the book with that.
No, it feels very integrated that way. It's really fascinating, the part, the early Hollywood that they're a part of, and the creating of the Screenwriters Guild, and which your father was instrumental in. How much was your, just to talk about your mother for a moment, she had a life of remarkable hardship in many ways. She was one of 8 children, right? Was it 8?
6.
6, sorry. Her mother was her husband had departed. She was left alone with all these kids. The mother packs little Faye off at 14 to go to LA with a kind of chaperone whom Vina, we pronounce her name, whom Vina, the mother, then turns against rather violently and yanks Faye away from him, although she's very fond of him. And then your mother had a first marriage to this gifted alcoholic manic depressive, which ended pretty tragically with his suicide, I believe. Yeah. And he took all her money. I mean, and kidnapped their child, your older sister. Was your mother my sense was that you learned a lot of these things in researching the book, that you knew some of them surely, but did your mother tell you all this? Was she voluble about all this, or did you have to learn it? She seemed like such a modest person.
Well, she was very forthcoming if I asked her questions, and I got to a point in my life where I peppered her with questions, but she also had written her own autobiography. So I felt that anything that she wrote about, I could extrapolate and use as a kind of guide. It is true that she was put on a train by herself as a 14-year-old girl to come to Hollywood and maybe get into the movies under the care of a young man who was a photographer who, as it turned out, was in love with her. And she had to cope with that. And then her mother yanked her away, followed it maybe a year later, and yanked her away from this young man who actually was sort of educating my mother and guiding her.
Gave her great books to read.
But my mother then got a little part in a movie, and that was enough to give her the courage to go to Hal Roach Studios and ask for work. And at age 15 and 16, she had a contract. She was working full-time and supporting her entire family. So at each turning point in my mother's life, there's really tough things that she has to deal with. And then she manages to push through, to survive. She has this kind of resilience and almost an internal pride that says, I'm not going to let this get me down. This will not defeat me. It was almost a kind of, I don't know, a belligerent charm. She had a lot of charm, but it was determination. And just as a little sidebar, someone gave my book to a woman who was going through serious chemotherapy and was feeling very depressed. And after she read the book, she said, if Faye could survive what she went through.
was
I
incredible.
could survive this, and she gave 14 copies to her best friends and made them read it. But you really do have that feeling, I think, from Faye, that there's a little moment, you and I talked about it yesterday, where her first husband, who was this very handsome, Oxford-educated, brilliant, charming man with two major weaknesses. One was alcohol, and the other was women. Tells my mother shortly after they're married that he is going to go back and resume his affair with his lover, who is the wife of Jesse Lasky, who owns Paramount Pictures, who's the co-owner. And it's like my mother just felt devastated. She'd married this dreamboat, and she begged him not to go, she said. She begged him not to go, and he went anyway. And she said to herself after that, I will never beg anyone again, and no one will ever define me or my feelings. I am in charge. So it was almost the difficulties that she faced that gave her this kind of resilience, which I don't think I certainly didn't appreciate as a child until I wrote the book. Yeah.
You have a lovely, I just wanted to read it really, really quickly, about King Kong, a lovely passage here, if I could just... well, why don't you read it, Vicki? Just this paragraph on page 124.
Okay.
We have to say something about King Kong.
My mother, you can't see it. She's with King Kong in the background and with Marion C. Cooper, who was the creator of King Kong. When my mother was offered the part of Ann Darrow in King Kong, co-director Marion C. Cooper told her that she would be cast opposite the tallest, darkest leading man in Hollywood. She thought he meant Cary Grant, which would have been a fulfillment of her dreams. If not Cary Grant, a very acceptable consolation prize, Clark Gable. She adapted to Kong and in time grew to appreciate and even treasure him. Every time I'm in New York, she said later in her life, I say a little prayer when passing the Empire State Building. A good friend of mine died up there.
And she wrote a beautiful, kind of hilarious, but quite a beautiful letter to King Kong in her autobiography, where she thanks him and talks about their friendship. And she didn't ever seem to have, I think other actresses and actors would have been troubled as the years went by that they were known for this, mostly for this one film when she made over 100 films.
Right.
But she never seemed to be bitter about that. Or did she ever have
a
moment where she just got sick of it?
I think there were times when she wished people would remember some of the other films that she had been in that she loved.
Right.
And obviously, when you do over 100 films, you hope somebody remembers a few of them. But she came to understand that King Kong was an iconic film.
Right.
And that, and she was beautiful in it. And it's a lovely performance, although a lot of it is a bit of too much screaming, as she thought at the time, and I kind of agree. But it's an iconic film. It was a breakthrough film in many ways, technologically and otherwise. It saved RKO from bankruptcy.
Right.
It has been a steady presence in film history and appreciated. So I think she came to see it, she found this obviously charming way of making King Kong and the character of Kong her friend and using it as a calling card.
Right.
Yeah.
Speaking of calling cards, you too use it as a calling card in this wonderful story about going to China in 1978. Would you tell that story briefly?
Yeah, so David, my husband who's here, and I went to China in 1978 when they didn't have anything but bicycles. If you remember those days, it was really, we were part of a group who were traveling, led by Norman Lear, the producer Norman Lear, and in our group was Mary Tyler Moore and her husband Grant Tinker, And Larry Gelbart, famous writer in Hollywood, he did MASH, and Carl Reiner, who everybody knows. So we all go off together, and we have this meeting with the Vice Minister of Cultural Affairs in this gigantic room where big overstuffed chairs, and Norman, who was probably one of the greatest sort of lovely MC personalities, is introducing everybody in our group, and he says, "This is Mary Tyler Moore here. She is beloved by every family in America. She's the most famous television star in the United States. This is Carl Reiner, brilliant writer, known by everyone in America, you know." And each time he introduces somebody, the Chinese who are lined up around the room go, "Oh." And that's it. You know, they don't know. They haven't seen anything since 1949. You know, they've been cut off from any American culture. So finally, he's going around the room, and he comes to me, and he looks at me and says, "Well, what am I going to say about her?" So he says, "Well, you might know Vicky's mother, because she was a famous actress in Hollywood. She was the star of King Kong, Fay Wray." Oh! And they get up and they start jumping around. Oh, King Kong! So now Mary looks at me, not happily. I'm just telling you, entre nous, she was not happy because no one in China recognized her. And now I'm the center of attention. I thought it was great myself.
Oh, that's wonderful. And wasn't it your mother's idea to be blonde in that film as well?
Yes, yeah. She designed the look of her hair and her dress. She was so happy. They just let her do whatever she wanted, and she had strong feelings about.
And it also seemed, I'm sure, you know, with liability things now, they would never ask her to do some of the physical things she had to do to be in Kong's hand. She talked about, well, one of the fingers of the big puppet hand. not a puppet.
So the actual Kong was just about like 18 inches high, and then they would, of course, blow that image up and use stop motion photography to make each one of his tiny little movements. You know, and when you see how much movement there is, you realize how laborious that is. And then they had a big hand, giant hand on a crane,
8 feet
long. And they would strap her in a cinch in the hand and then crank it up like, 30 feet in the air. And then Cooper no net. And Cooper would say, "Okay, Faye, wiggle and scream,"
This is Marion Cooper, the director.
And she would be screaming. Well, on a couple occasions, the cinch came loose. And she's screaming, "Help, let me down, get me out of here." And he's saying, "Great, that's one more, So, and then he worked her 24 hours at one point. And he came home and bragged to his wife and said, "I worked Faye 24 hours. And his wife said, "Never, ever do that again." She was an actress. And this was before the Screen Actors Guild and the rules that, it could only work 12 hours, which is plenty long to begin with. So, but she didn't mind. I think she was having a wonderful time, and she was making another movie on the same set at the same time called The Most Dangerous Game. So she was a very, very hardworking and much in demand actress through this era.
Now, as for your dad, we can say that he and his director, Capra, kind of invented the screwball comedy. Can we say that? Can we make that claim?
So, film historians, who I believe sometimes, if I want, say that It Happened One Night was the first screwball comedy. Right. But I sort of see the seeds in my father's earlier screenplays and films of the screwball-ish comedies, where the women are the driving force in the story. And
is there one in particular? Is it Platinum Blonde?
Platinum Blonde? Yeah. I think Jean Harlow is pretty good in it, but it's a wonderfully written part. I think Jean Harlow was not well, anyway, had she been a stronger actress,
Right.
it would have been the first screwball comedy. But no, but It Happened One Night is generally considered actually the first romantic comedy, because many comedies before that time were kind of among very wealthy people,
Right.
and drawing room kind of high society. Yeah.
Right. But this kind of, I think, isn't the screwball, one of the definitions of screwball comedies, that it's a kind of cross-class
A cross-class.
situation.
Right.
But
Right.
he also was a message man. I mean, he believed in the little guy, and
Right.
his movies are full of that as well, right?
Right. So everything that he wrote, he was trying to find a way to, with warmth and caring, draw in an audience, and to convey the idea that we're all in this together, and that people are basically good, and that we need to help each other. And this is at a time when the country was very divided, and that message is strung throughout all of his films in
It
one
is,
way or
isn't
another.
it?
Yeah. And Mr. Deeds and Meet John Doe and
watched
Lost Horizon may be a little bit different, but yeah.
But Lost Horizon surely has a message in it.
It does, and he was a big fan of Thoreau, of
Henry David Thoreau.
Henry
you said,
David
yeah.
Thoreau,
Yeah.
and the idea that we need to think about who we are as a society, as a collective, and not just follow the herd,
Right.
and kind of dig deeper to our more spiritual selves.
Right.
And so those ideas permeate all of his work. Even in It Happened One Night, and he was a very romantic man.
Right.
So romantic movies were natural for him, but he had a sense of wit. So they were always kind of elliptical, two people trying to find each other.
Right.
Or
right.
a character who's gone off the rails trying to get back on their footing, on their right track.
He something about both your parents what was so striking to me is that they seem to be absolutely the same people in public as they were in private. They were consistent. They were both good, decent, compassionate, caring people. That there wasn't a big disconnect between their public persona or what he wrote and being a sort of private, perhaps not a stellar human. I mean,
There were plenty of screenwriters who wrote great screenplays and were complete whatever.
and actresses who could sort of turn it on and turn it off.
Right.
Your mother sounded like there was nothing narcissistic about her.
She had self-confidence. She knew how to charm people.
Yeah.
But she was not a selfish person at all. She was a very generous person, very generous. Yeah.
Do you? Oh, we need to take questions from the audience. Okay, great. I mean, I have a million. Anyway. Yes.
Should we take questions from the audience?
Let's take questions from the audience.
Someone very
And
subtly
we didn't even
said
get
so.
into your mother's amazing romances with Clifford Odets
Yeah.
and others.
Jill.
There's a lot of kind of fun Hollywood stuff we didn't get into. But does anybody have any questions?
Yes,
for
George.
Vicki?
Yep. George and then Susan. You want to go to the microphone so that you, yep.
An observation that I think your mother is unique in American film history in that her actual name has become the name of the character in King Kong. And I'm referring in literary history, for example, Thomas Pynchon's Gravity's Rainbow. He refers to Fay Wray and King Kong.
Right.
And then has a story built around that. Would you care to comment on that?
Well, it's kind of interesting because the name of the character was actually Anne Darrow, but she, in and of herself, she's become a kind of separate iconic character. Not even the actress, but sort of the character of Fay Wray. So whether it's Gravity's Rainbow, which is a wonderful example, or the dog Fay Wray that William Wegman photographed, or every time once a year, the New York Times says, Ray of Kong. She's become kind of iconic in her own right. It's a curious thing, but I kind of like that, Don't you think that's kind of nice? Yeah. Susan, you had a question?
Who else? Anybody have any questions?
I do.
There's Sue. Sorry, Sue.
First of all, I think your sense of humor is so infectious and wonderful all through the book. Pathos, yes, but also very witty and wonderful. Could you talk a little bit about your father's with the Screen Actors Guild?
Oh, right. So, if you can do kind of a time travel with me back to the 1930s, it was the beginning of the labor movement in the United States. And a quarter of the country, of the working adults, were unemployed. It was a very, very tough time. And in Hollywood, actors and writers and the camera people, what they call the below-the-line people, were being worked to death. I mean, it was just a constant grind. And so that was the beginning of trying to form unions, banding together so that collectively people could protect themselves. It was a high-stakes game, because if you came out as a strong union person, you could just simply be fired. There was no protection. For whatever reason, my father, who was at Columbia, and Harry Cohen, who ran Columbia, was a pretty tough guy and anti-union all the way. But my father began to take an interest in the union movement, and there were those who felt that the union movement was a global movement, and that they should be fighting the Spanish Civil War. And he said, no, a union is really about helping those who are young and are just getting into the business and need protection. So there were two unions, because to counter the union that was being created by writers, the studios formed their own unions and told writers, if you join the studio union, we'll give you a contract. And so a lot of writers peeled off and went with the union that was part of the studio, but my father did not. And he stood up for for the union. They lost a huge number of members, and then finally, 3 years later, when they took a vote to establish a union, and it took like 8 years until the Writers Guild got its first contract. It was a very tough time, and people were playing very high-stakes games.
Vicki, would you also talk a moment about, kind of a great full circle situation was that you were head of the writers, you ran the Writers Guild.
So, yes.
Was that, did you
I'm getting
think
a
of it as an
signal here, so I
homage?
just need to know one more. Okay, I'll answer Jenny's question. So it's no surprise that I married a man who was president of the Writers Guild. And that wasn't enough, because he said, now it's your turn. So when I became a screenwriter myself, I was president of the Writers Guild, the first woman to be president of the...
Woo!
And the first woman. I have to qualify that, because the first woman was first president was a woman in the 30s, but then the amalgamated Writers Guild when they joined with the television writers, and we still have huge fights, and we're still on the right side. And I understand what sacrifices going back to the 30s and up through today. What sacrifices people have
Sorry,
made.
Vicki.
Yeah,
sorry.
yeah.
Can you
Yeah.
just say quickly, I think our minders want us to move on, but just in terms of being a writer's daughter and a writer yourself, one of the things you talk about the book is your work in not having the director, the so-called vanity credit of the director above the title.
Yeah,
Would you say something about that?
So quickly, just to say that when directors say it's a film by, and in my father's case, Frank Capra, that is about as offensive as anything a writer can experience. And so when I was president of the Writers Guild, we mounted a campaign to call that the vanity credit.
The vanity credit.
To say that if the directors take that credit, it's because of their vanity. Because the truth is that of the Frank Capra, Robert Riskin films, the philosophy, the humor, the charm, the warmth, the romance was all Robert Riskin. And Capra did a beautiful job of directing those stories. So I'll stop there.